Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to this introduction to classical literature. In the previous lecture, we talked about the various Greek philosophers, the Greek thinkers. Today, we are going to talk about the few Roman writers like Horace, Ovid, Juvenile, and we will also talk about the various classical genres and then Greek mythology. The Roman writer Horace, 65 to 68 BC. Horace's contribution to literary and philosophical thought has been aptly summed up in the following observation. What Cicero had done in the sphere of rhetoric was now carried over by Horace into the realm of poetry. He recalled to men's minds the standards of classical art, while directing their steps back to the poetry of antiquity. And he undoubtedly stands out as the Roman influential of Roman critics, one who achieved results of a lasting kind and was to rank in stature with Aristotle at the Renaissance. Horace's main critical postulations are found in his Ars Poetica, the art of poetry, a work which equaled Aristotle's Poetics in its influence during the Renaissance. Though critics have found it difficult to assign any date to Horace's work, it's believed that Ars Poetica could have been written around 15 BC. Ars Poetica literally means a treatise of the art of written poetry. Some critics have pointed out to the apparent formless and unsystematic appearance of Ars Poetica. However, its subject matter falls into three definite divisions. The first division is about poesis, or a discussion on the subject matter of poetry. The second is about poema, or the form. The third is poeta, or the poet. In this part, advice is given to poets while examining the function of poetry. Ars Poetica opens with the assertion that a poem must have organic unity. In a poem, as in a painting, all the parts should be vitally connected with one another. Horace's view is that poetry is not mere imitation, it's creative. Poets are free to indulge their fancy, to use their imitation, but they should be true to life. Imagination must not be overdone. In the second part, he discusses plot, characterization, and dramatic style. The plot must be based on only familiar stories. These stories, by skillful treatment, may be given novelty. New themes also may be invented by their successful treatment, require skill and genius from the author. Characters must be true to type and must be consistent. Characters drawn from tradition must preserve their original traits. The dramatic style must vary in accordance with character, mood, and circumstances. The subject matter of the third part, poeta, is the poet. The art of poetry requires long and persistent labor. The focus is on polished workmanship, which is the outcome of consistent toil. A poet must not be in a hurry to publish. The work should be able to stand the test of at least a decade. It's important for a poet to be a keen observer of man and manners, and the poet's themes should be drawn from the book of life. A poet's own life should imbibe nobility and dignity and a clear avoidance of indulgence in absurdities and extravagancies. The poet's aim should be to instruct or please or combine both. Poetry has great power and appeal. To Horace, the idea of poetic madness or inspiration is absurd. Excess must be kept under restraint. As for the choice of subject, choose a theme suited to your powers and ponder long what weighs your shoulders refuse to bear and what they can support. Further, the language of poetry should be different from the language of common man because the essence of art lies in the creation of beauty. So the poet should give something finer and higher than common life and use a finer, more polished language. Horace takes ancient Greek literature as his standard, advocates an imitation of these works, and thus asserts the supremacy of classical Greek literature. He recommends the method of recreation of the art of evolving something new out of the existing and the old. Another Roman writer, Ovid, 43 BC to 8 AD. Ovid's works include a rough chronological order: the Amours, Heroides, Ars, Amatoria, and Metamorphoses. Ovid wrote in elegiacs and documented as one of the favorite Latin poets of the Middle Ages. Metamorphoses, which states, "Change is my subject," was not merely a brilliant collection of much of the classical mythology, which involved changes of state or being people into animals, plants, rocks, fountains, and even stars. It provided a kind of form or template for poetic realization of a whole world. Juvenile, 60 to 130 AD, a satirical poet whose extant works consist of 16 satires, depicting contemporary society and denouncing its vices. Satire was a genre of poetry invented and developed by the Romans. When it came to Juvenal's hands, he stamped his mark of indignation upon it. For the Romans, satire denoted a particular form of discourse, a genre of poetry with rules, and not merely an attitude or a voice. Like all authors of Greco-Roman literature, which had its unwritten laws, these laws prescribed the choice of meter and form, material, presentation, and language. The meter was the dactylic hexameter, the meter of epic poetry, and the form required composition of short to middle length, usually in the range of 50 to 250 lines. The material included matters of morality, education, and literature. The type of presentation was the autobiographical monologue with occasional extensions into dialogue, epistle, or narrative. Though Roman verse satire uses the autobiographical monologue as the chief mode of presentation, this does not mean that the satirists are necessarily using their satires to convey their personal feelings to the world. Authors in all genres of romantic literature, Roman literature, including Roman verse satire, were accustomed to creating characters. In some genres, this is more obvious than in others. For example, in drama and in epic, where these characters are given names, but in personal genres of poetry, love, elegy, lyric poetry, epigram, and satire, the character or persona mask is frequently presented as a first-person voice. This ensured a relationship between speaker and audience, providing a sense of participation and evoking a response from the listener. It must be remembered that most Greek and Latin literature was written for oral delivery by the author or another voice to a live audience. For the Romans, there were two types of satires, one in prose and the other in verse. The two share many characteristics, but the Romans privileged the verse form. This is perhaps because the prose type, often called Manichaean satire, had its roots in Greek culture, specifically in the diatribe, which asks a kind of sermon associated with Hellenistic philosophical schools such as Cynicism. In contrast, the verse form was claimed as Roman. Now let us move to the various genres in classical literature. Epic poetry. The evolution of the two great epics, Iliad and Odyssey, follows the same pattern as that of the early epics of great nations. However, it's assumed that epic poetry goes back much earlier than the Iliad and Odyssey and the other written epics that gained currency in the Archaic period. The heroic age of epic tradition contains a hard core of historical reality. Archaeology confirms that the towns remembered in epic and in Greek mythology, which we are going to discuss very soon, as being rich and powerful down to 13th or 12th century BC, and in most cases never reached such status again. The tradition of epic poetry must have been exclusively oral in its earlier phases, as Greece was illiterate until the 8th century. The Iliad and Odyssey, written poems, though they are show signs of an oral ancestry, the poet summons the muse at the beginning to tell or sing him the story so that listeners can hear the report. Each performer learned the traditional stories by listening to other performers and learned a traditional style in which to tell them. Lyric poetry. When the Greek grew tired of epics, Stesichorus recast the stories in choral lyrics. The lyric or the personal culminates in two great figures, Alcaeus and Sappho in the 6th century. Both came from aristocratic class of the islands of Lesbos, and both were exiled by the democratic faction for taking active part in a conspiracy by the nobility to recapture power. Alcaeus was a firebrand who mingled politics with poetry. Sappho was hailed by Plato as the most lyrical of the Greek poets. The 10th muse, Sappho herself, set her poems to music for the harp, a musical instrument, and though this harp is dead, the musical quality of her poems cannot be missed. Round about me hum the winds of autumn, cool between the apple buffs, slumber flowing from the quivering leaves to earthward, spreads as a river. The melodic or melic poetry of Sappho poems highlights social factors like a thriving women's society or unmarried women or girls who gathered in Sappho's house to practice music and song and at other times sang in public at weddings and festivals. Greek drama. It had its roots in religious rituals. The English word tragedy is derived from the Greek. Greek tragedy developed specifically in Attica region around Athens in the 6th century. Classic Greek theatre was written and performed solely by men, including all the female parts and choruses. The playwright also composed the music, choreographed the dances, and directed the actors. Aeschylus is usually considered the first of great Greek playwrights and essentially invented what we think of as drama in the 5th century BC with his introduction of dialogue and interacting characters into playwriting. Sophocles is credited with developing irony as a literary technique and extended what was considered allowable in drama. More than at any other time in history, the drama in Greece was an art in which the whole community participated. The dramas were staged during the festival of Dionysus and the plays were selected by competition. Artisans competed by the privilege of paying the cost of training the singers, dancers and actors and meeting the other expenses of production. Timeless legends, origins in rituals imparted to Greek drama a serious temper. Unlike modern drama, a study of character in conflict with oneself, and Elizabethan drama, where a study of action or man in conflict with man, Greek drama was a study of man in relation to the gods, of fate, of the dark, obscure, positive meaning in fate. Now, Greek comedy. Greek comedy is conventionally divided into three periods of traditions: Old Comedy, New Comedy, Middle Comedy. Old comedy is characterized by very topical political satire, often attacking specific public figures using individualized masks and often irreverence towards both men and gods. It survives today largely in the form of 11 plays of Aristophanes. The main elements of a comedy were paradox, the entrance of the chorus chanting and singing verses, one or more parabases where chorus addresses the audience directly, the agon, a formal debate between a protagonist and antagonist, often with the chorus acting as judge, and the episodes. In all forms of literature, prose, poetry, drama, and fiction, we find a host of allusions to a number of myths of ancient Greece and Rome. A knowledge of this cultural background is essential to understand any piece of composition. It was all for today. In the coming lecture, we will learn about the Greek mythology. Thank you for your kind patience.